Good afternoon. I'm Karen Poniachik, head of Columbia University's Global Center here in Santiago. And on behalf of ourselves and the Center for International Policy at Universidad Católica, whose director Jorge Sahd is here with us, I want to welcome you to the third installment of our series on U.S. foreign policy during Biden government. We had Andrew Nathan talk about China, then we had Ambassador Westphal talk about the Middle East, and now we're lucky to have with us Charles Kupchan to speak about the traditional, the oldest allies of the United States, which is the countries of the European Union. I will introduce Charles. He's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and professor of international affairs at Georgetown. He served both in the Clinton administration and the Obama administration on the National Security Council in charge of European affairs. And he's author of several books on international affairs, the latest one entitled Isolationism, A History of America's Efforts to Shield Itself from the World, which was just published. So I hope, Charles, you can also touch on that. For those who want more on that, there's a great interview. I think it's in YouTube by Richard Haas to Charles about precisely this book. So, but I hope, Charles, you can touch on that. So without further ado, I will turn the screen over to you with a general question. And then, of course, we can take more questions, which is the President of the European Commission spoke of a renewed partnership, and Jens Stoltenberg, who's the head of NATO, welcomed the election of Joe Biden, who he described as, quote, a strong supporter of NATO and the transatlantic relationship. So can we expect a full-scale revival of the old traditional European alliance? What is the Biden team looking forward to? And what needs to be done to restore the axis that Trump, with a lot of effort, tried to destroy? So the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join you. I wish that it were in person, but I guess this is the best we can do until we beat this pandemic. We're living through the strangest political moment of my lifetime. Joe Biden just formally received the endorsement of the Electoral College, but the sitting president of the United States has yet to, acknowledge what's coming. The Republican Party seems to be unwilling to face reality, and so my first comment is that the kind of U.S.-European relationship is today an odd mixture of relief, but also trauma and exhaustion. I can't understate or overstate the degree to which it has been a searing 4 years. For those of you who don't live in the United States, it's been quite painful and unrecognizable. And so I think there really is a sense of political trauma that comes with the view that we are heading back toward better days, both in terms of American politics, but also America's relationships with its traditional allies in Europe. The second observation I would make to get us going is that I think that one of the questions I've had in my own mind over the last 4 or 5 years is, have we been witnessing the steady and irreversible erosion of political centrism in favor of populism on the left and right? We knew that Trump was more a symptom than a cause. We knew that this was a systemic problem because the problem of illiberalism has not been just something the United States has dealt with. It's in the UK, it's in Poland, it's in Hungary, it's in Turkey. There was a government in Italy that was heading in the same direction. And so there really was a sense of, is the transatlantic community in irreversible decline when it comes to liberal democracy? And I think right now we have reason to believe that the political center has shown itself to be durable, and the pendulum is swinging back. And so I think this is a shot in the arm for liberal democracy on both sides of the Atlantic, but it is not, we are not out of the woods. This is chapter 2 or 3 of a book that's got at least 10 chapters. And I think that what we need to do is to learn lessons from the Trump era, not turn our backs on the Trump era. We need to address the fact that 74 million people in the United States just voted for Trump, despite the fact that the last 4 years have been quite, as I said, quite shocking. And so that says to me that we have a lot of hard work to do when it comes to addressing the economic insecurities and the status insecurities of our electorates on both sides of the Atlantic. My third observation is that, and I do think this is causing a certain amount of outpouring of relief in Europe, is that I think we will see the United States go back on January 20th to being a team player. For me, the most destructive part of Trump's America First has been the unilateralism, pulling out of the WHO, pulling out of the Paris Agreement, scuttling arms control, slapping tariffs on everybody. In many respects, Trump took a wrecking ball to the world that America and its allies made after World War II. And Biden is going to go back and try to rebuild that world. And Europeans are multilateralists. They are team players. They believe in institutionalized cooperation. And they are delighted to have someone coming back to the Oval Office who shares that view about how to organize international affairs. Let me conclude my remarks with a couple of observations about where we are likely to see more continuity than change from Trump, and where I see the relationship with Europe not necessarily being troubled, but where we're going to have to work through issues together. The first is that I do think that Biden is going to be focused like a laser on domestic politics, on the pandemic, on the economy, investment in infrastructure, investment in R&D, investment in worker retraining. And that's because, as I've said, I think he shares the view that I hold and that many others hold. We've just gone through a near-death experience here in the United States. We need to figure out what's gone wrong in the operation of our democratic system and fix it. And I think in many respects, that means addressing the underlying problems. And so I think that even though the Europeans would like the United States to kind of come back to the robust brand of internationalism that they're used to, it won't happen, in part because so much of the agenda of the Biden administration will focus on domestic priorities. That doesn't mean a turn inward. It doesn't mean the US is going to cut and run, but it does mean a set of priorities that are different than those of the past. And I think that the isolationist sentiment that we've seen under Trump, the turn inward, the public opposition to the forever wars in the Middle East, the public opposition to more free trade, the concern that we've been building schools in Afghanistan rather than Arkansas. This is all going to be part of American debate moving forward. These issues do not disappear on January 20th. And so I think that the Europeans should be prepared to do more. I think that Trump's withdrawal from the Middle East, the ending of the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria will continue. And as a consequence, there will be a vacuum of sorts. We already see that vacuum in Libya, in the Mediterranean, in Syria. The US was missing in action when it came to Nagorno-Karabakh. I think that Biden will be much more diplomatically active, but Europeans should not labor under the illusion that the US is going to go back to being the policeman of first and last resort. Those days are over. A second area where I think you're going to see a need for collaboration, consultation, deliberation is on China, where Europeans are concerned about the growing escalation of rivalry between the US and China. That's not going to go away on January 20. The underlying conflicts over trade, over human rights, over geopolitics, they're not going away. And I think the US and the Europeans should come together and have an early discussion about how to manage China geopolitically, how to level the playing field when it comes to trade, and what common stance they should take on human rights. I don't think that the Europeans want to get caught in between China and the US. And as a consequence, there should be early consultation and attempt to align policies. Russia is another area where I think you will see potential divergence. There are some key issues on the agenda, including sanctions against Russia stemming from Ukraine and from interference in elections. There are many Europeans that would like to get rid of those sanctions and go back to business as normal. Another touchy issue is Nord Stream 2, a new pipeline that runs from Russia into Germany. There's a lot of opposition to that. There are potential sanctions related to participation in Nord Stream 2. This is going to be, I think, an issue of contention fairly early on. And one of the things that I'll be looking to see is whether there is an effort by the Biden administration, not just to open a dialogue with Russia, particularly on Ukraine, but to see whether it might not be possible to pull Russia westward geopolitically. I think that the quasi-alliance between Russia and China is fragile, and that someday in the not too distant future, the Kremlin is going to wake up and realize that its eastern flank is in some ways much more vulnerable than its western flank. And perhaps Washington and the EU can take advantage of that to somehow begin to return to a better relationship with Russia. There are lots of other issues on the agenda, including Brexit. But I think what I'll do is stop there to preserve as much time as possible for our conversation. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Charles, for your initial reflections on this topic. And the European Union came up with a document entitled A New European Union-US Agenda for Global Change. Among others, the document states that the European Union wants to ally with the United States to boost global cooperation and tackle the strategic challenge of China. Do you expect that the US and the EU will be willing to push a collective action to tackle the growing role of China, or it will be difficult?
Well, as I said, I think the big news on foreign policy is the return to multilateralism and teamwork, and Europe will benefit from that swing back toward multilateralism more than any other part of the world, because the United States has looked to Europe as its most important partner, and I don't see that changing anytime. And so when it comes to the big issues on the table, climate change, Iran, cybersecurity, trade, and China, Europe is going to be the go-to partner and the first port of call, if you will, for the Biden administration. I don't want to underestimate the difficulty. I mean, I think the Europeans have grown more skeptical of China over the course of 2020. the lack of forthright disclosures on the pandemic, very heavy-handed diplomacy in Europe, what's now called wolf diplomacy, has alienated many Europeans. And in that sense, I think the kind of the tilt toward Beijing that we saw a year or two ago, that is not likely to be as pronounced. That having been said, the Chinese already own more than a dozen or have big stakes in more than a dozen major ports in Europe. Belt and Road is coming. EU needs to rebuild its economy in the aftermath of the pandemic. It will look to Chinese trade and investment to do that. So I do think the devil will be in the details, and that the United States should develop a joint agenda, an economic agenda on China that would include the following elements. One is pressure on China on the liberalization of the trade issue, state subsidies, state ownership, intellectual property. Two, to decide in this big ball of wax that we call decoupling, what should be pursued and what should not. I don't believe that there will be European or US decoupling from China. We are way past that point. The global economy is far too interdependent. Just before we started this call, in our chat before, you were telling me that China is all over Chile. We're not putting the genie back in the bottle. But I do think that we can have a serious conversation about repatriating supply lines and production lines in high-tech sectors, AI, semiconductors. We should develop a joint position on 5G networks and Huawei. In other words, yes, decoupling makes sense, but only in certain specific areas. Do I think that the US and Europe can get to yes on these kinds of issues? I do, but it's going to require a lot more consultation than we're used to, because in general, the US, EU, and the NATO relationship has really focused on the transatlantic community and not on the Asia Pacific.
Thank you, Charles. Karen? We cannot hear.
Microphone was off. Let's go back to Russia, Charles, just to mention that Joe Biden talked about Vladimir Putin's kleptocratic authoritarian system, quote unquote. How will the relationship play? And the extension of the New START nuclear arms reduction expires, which the treaty expires now in February. Is it, and Trump has refused to sign it, is it a priority for Biden's government? What do you see happening on that? And on, yesterday, Trump imposed sanctions on Turkey for buying Russia's military equipment. So that's another front. So how will things evolve in these two fronts?
I think that one of the more interesting issues to keep an eye on is the tension that will exist in the Biden administration between a more idealist bent and a more realist bent. Because Biden himself is a strong believer in democracy and supporting democracy promotion. He was an ardent fan of Ukraine after the 2014 Russian invasion. And I expect that he will be speaking out more openly about Putin, about Erdogan, about President Xi in China, about Sisi. Trump liked autocrats. Biden does not like autocrats. He will speak up about that. On the other hand, you can't solve many of the world's problems today by working only with democracies. I mean, look at Russia. It's in Syria. It's in Libya. It brokered the peace deal in Nagorno-Karabakh. If Ukraine is going to enjoy sovereignty again, there needs to be some kind of strategic dialogue with the Russians. And so I think there'll be a kind of an internal tug of war between the more idealist bent, and you look at someone like Tony Blinken, the incoming Secretary of State, he's kind of a forward-leaning interventionist pro-democracy. But as I said, the United States is going to want to get things done. It's going to want to solve problems. And when it comes to some of the key problems, and you just mentioned one, Karen, arms control, you need the Russians. When it comes to the pandemic, you probably need the Chinese. When it comes to Syria and Libya, you need Turkey. So my best guess is that pragmatism is going to prevail over ideology, in part because the agenda at home is so pressing that Biden is going to look for results. He's going to be a results-oriented president. To me, on the arms control issue, that means, I'm guessing here, I have no privileged information, an effort to extend START and then build on it, both with the Russians and perhaps with the Chinese. But I do think that we've gone through a period in which the US let things lapse. The INF treaty, START now looks to be lapsing. The Iran nuclear deal, look what happened there. Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. Iran now has a much larger stockpile of enriched uranium and is spinning new generation centrifuges. So I think there'll be a view that, listen, we need to do what we can on these fronts and build on them. So I'm guessing what you'll see here is an effort to extend START and then do follow-on agreements rather than let the whole thing come tumbling down.
Charles, you know that the US-EU relationship will also be defined for different global challenges ahead. And Bruce Jones from the Brookings Institute asked if middle powers can lead the world out of the pandemic. In other words, the role of middle powers, let's say France, Germany. Do you think that these middle powers can take the initiative to lead the efforts that also require US, but these middle powers taking the initiative, for example, in order to rebuild the multilateral system? Or do you think that China and US are the only countries that can lead, or we able to lead the future global challenges?
I think that the EU is a critical player, but can't do it alone. The EU is a quasi actor in the sense that it is not a federation like the United States, but it is much more than a loose grouping of sovereign nations. It does have geopolitical heft as a collective unit. And we've seen it come together on Brexit. We've seen it come together on the pandemic. We've seen it take a common stance on migration, even though it's very controversial. But we also see that even when the EU steps up, it can't do it alone. The data point that most comes to mind for me would be on the pandemic, when Merkel and Macron and others came together and said, let's do this together. Let's anchor a multilateral effort to deal with the pandemic. Vaccines, medical equipment, science, and the United States and India and China, they didn't show up at the party. And without those big players, you can't get it done. So I would say that no, I don't think that Europe can alone anchor the multilateral system, but Europe has to be part of that system if we're going to see a successful brand of multilateralism evolve, hopefully with China as a player as well.
If I may, Charles, you mentioned the Nord Stream 2. There's another confrontation which has to do with trade, which is between Airbus and Boeing, which, it's a dispute that has been taking place for a long time, and which lies at the heart of the tensions mainly. The US, just to give some background, the US was awarded the right to impose punitive tariffs on $7.5 billion dollars of European good as a result of the WTO ruling that the EU and 4 of its member states had failed to get rid of illegal state support for Airbus. And then you have now the WTO rule that US Boeing has also collected billions in unlawful assistance, so we can expect tariffs against the US. Is this something that's going to be solved in some way?
You know, this dispute has been running for a long time.
Right.
And my best guess is what we'll see is an attempt to turn back to the status quo ante. That is to say, to undo the recent tariffs that Trump slapped on and to kind of get us back to where we were before. I'm not really expecting there to be progress beyond the status quo ante, for example, on the aircraft dispute, because I don't expect to see either party lean in heavily on the trade front, at least for the first year or two. And I would put the British in here. I mean, the British, they've been very keen on a free trade deal with the United States as they leave the EU. I don't think it's going to happen. Neither Democrats nor Republicans in this country right now are big free traders. And I don't think that there will be a priority put on this issue, with the exception of trying to put pressure on China to level the playing field. So I'm guessing what you'll see is a scaling back of the Trump tariffs, but then the continuation of disagreements and WTO cases over the Boeing Airbus issue. And then, as we talked a little bit about already, Nord Stream 2 is a pretty tough issue, in part because it is so close to being finished, and in part because Germany is the country that is most keen and has been investing in it. And Germany is in many respects America's most important European partner. So it's going to be a tough issue to resolve.
Okay, Charles, let's move to Brexit. It's an interesting issue, you know, that both parties are negotiating. What would be, in your opinion, the consequences for United States in case of a non-deal Brexit, and to what extent it may affect the relationship between US and UK, and at the same time, the US and the EU? How do you see that process?
You know, a no-deal Brexit would be a pretty disruptive event. Britain's relationship with the EU would resort to WTO rules. There could be shortages in the UK, miles of backup trying to get across the English Channel. And perhaps most worryingly, some kind of disruption on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, as that border returns to being a hard border and not an intra-EU border. So it's a pretty bleak picture. And in some ways, even more worrying than that immediate economic scenario would be the political fallout. There would be enormous bad blood between the UK and the EU on both sides. And my hope is that the UK stays as closely tethered to Europe as possible on trade and on security. That would be good for Europe, good for the UK, and good for the United States. That would be very hard to do in the case of a no-deal Brexit. And I do think that, we talk about the special relationship with the US, between the US and the UK, but unfortunately, that special relationship is not going to be as consequential as it used to be, because the British are engaging in an act of self-isolation. They are taking themselves out of the center of the action. They're doing it democratically, it's their choice. I hope it goes well. But this idea of global Britain out there astride the world and, going back to the 19th century in Pax Britannica, dream on.
Thank you.
You talked about, I'm moving back and forth from different topics, but you talked about liberalism as opposed to liberal democracies. What about Hungary and Poland? The situation they're living, the fact that they're jeopardizing liberal values upon which the EU was built, is this going to have some consequences? Do you see them doing like, I would call it leaving the EU or breaking up with the EU? And maybe, I'm mentioning Hungary and Poland. Other countries might also join the club eventually. I mean, is this a danger to the EU?
It is a danger to the EU, because the EU is a community of countries that came together based upon certain values, certain norms of governance, rule of law, judicial independence. And Hungary and Poland are jeopardizing some of those core values by stacking the courts, by taking over the media, by engaging in practices that we really don't consider to be consistent with liberal democracy. And the EU really has not been able to do much about it. Yes, the EU invoked what's called Article 7, but it is unable to actually take steps of suspending voting rights, because that requires unanimity, and Hungary vetoes that for Poland and Poland for Hungary. And most recently, we saw the EU pay a price for not standing up to Hungary and Poland, because Hungary and Poland vetoed the pandemic stimulus bill, the first time in history in which the EU was ready to take on collective debt, because they didn't like tying economic assistance to good governance at home. So it's a tough and it's a controversial issue, but my recommendation to the Europeans would be, don't let this go on unchecked. Take steps to make it clear that countries that violate basic norms of governance will pay a price for it. It's interesting that this is all happening democratically. That is to say, the leaders in these countries are being democratically elected. They're achieving levels of majoritarian rule, and then they change the rules once they're there. The same thing has happened in Turkey. And it's very scary to watch it, in part because it almost happened here in the United States.
Talking about the Trump administration, I'm going to pick up on an article you wrote at the Washington Post. It says aspects of Trump's foreign policy were good for the U.S. Biden should keep them. What we know, which were the bad ones? Which are the good ones, or were the good ones?
Well, as I said earlier on in our conversation, we need to harvest lessons from Trump, not turn our backs on him. I'm not a Trump supporter, but he was tapping into very powerful political strains in the American electorate. And those strains have to do with a foreign policy that overreached. And that's why I believe that Biden should continue the retrenchment, particularly from the Middle East. I think that Biden has tapped into discontent with free trade. Trump. And that's why I encourage Biden to both stand up to China on trade, but even more importantly, to invest in American workers. Trump, I'll put it rather bluntly, Trump was a charlatan in the sense that he made all of these pledges that he was going to improve the lives of average Americans, and he didn't do much about it. And that's because he was asking great questions and giving not very satisfactory answers. And now we're living through the worst health crisis in the United States in over 100 years. I'm not sure what the situation is in Chile, but it's pretty bad here. Two of my students at Georgetown told me yesterday they have COVID. I've got many friends who have COVID. Bottom line is Donald Trump dropped the ball. He didn't do anything to deal with this problem. And that sort of increases the degree to which Biden has a full plate. So again, I think Trump told us that we need to make sure that the average American is doing better, feels more secure, and figure out how to do that. One final issue that's particularly controversial, I didn't deal with it in the article that you mentioned, but it weighs on my mind, and that is immigration. Because Trump, I think, correctly felt that many Americans believe that we don't have a functioning immigration policy. And that's because we don't. It doesn't really work. I'm a liberal when it comes to immigration. I want to see the numbers go up, but I'm also someone who believes the country needs to have a working policy. We need to know who's coming. We need to know who's going. We need to have control over the borders. So again, I think Trump was asking the right question. How can we have a serious functioning immigration policy? The problem was that his answer, building a wall on the border with Mexico and keeping people out, hasn't really worked.
Charles, what do you think about the President Macron's reflection on the future of the European Union? He said about European Union needs to be a political project, not only a single market. What do you think about the stage of the European Union, especially during the COVID and after COVID?
Well, I have mixed feelings about Macron. On the one hand, I'm delighted that there is finally a European leader who's willing to stand up and defend Europe and talk about a more capable, stronger, more coherent European Union. For too long, European leaders tended to run away from Europe because they didn't think it was popular politically. In fact, I remember when I was working for Obama, we flew over to the UK to try to talk the British out of voting for Brexit. That didn't work so well. But right after we stopped in London, we went to Germany, and Obama gave this speech, this rousing speech in defense of Europe. And those of us who were with him and who wrote the speech were saying to ourselves, why is he giving this speech? Why isn't Merkel giving it? Why isn't Hollande giving it? Well, now you actually have a French president who's giving speeches like that, and that's great. My regret is that he is talking about strategic autonomy. I mean, you may have seen an interview that he gave after Biden had won. It was in a journal called Le Grand Continent, the big continent. And he said, we need to resist the US-China duopoly. We need strategic autonomy to be independent from the United States. That's not realistic. Europe, for now, does not have the capability to be independent and to take matters into its own hands. And so I think sometimes Macron gets ahead of himself. And so I would encourage him to continue to be an enthusiastic supporter of a stronger Europe, but a stronger Europe that continues its close partnership with Americans.
A strong Europe, which means that also that Germany and other countries will be putting more money into NATO, which is one of the points that Trump made, not only with regards to Germany, but also with regards to South Korea at some point. But should when you say become stronger, should the Germans and France and the other countries contribute more to NATO?
Yes. I mean, I think, this is a push that has been going on for a long time. Everyone talks about this 2% target for spending of GDP on defense. Well, where did that target come from? Obama. He pushed it on the Europeans in the 2014 summit, NATO summit in Wales. And then Trump has continued and give Trump credit. He succeeded in getting the Europeans to increase their defense spending. I'm in some ways less concerned about spending, although it is important, and more concerned about how it is spent.
Mm-hmm.
I would rather see the Europeans pool their effort, decide who's going to do what, create battalions of mixed soldiers that represent a cross section of EU member states. The EU actually spends a reasonable amount of money, EU members, on defense, but it punches below its weight. And so my key invitation would be figure out how to increase spending, but more importantly, how to spend it so that you actually get more bang for the buck.
Charles, if the former ambassador Carlos Portales asked the following question. You said that Biden will be more concerned with domestic policy and will not be able to solve world problems. But this is not expected. The dilemma is how to influence the world, centrally, not by force. The subject matter is if a new American diplomacy with less stress on force and more on influences and alliances, more political, could emerge. How the US will act with others, European Union and others. This is the question and comment from Carlos Portales.
Yes, I didn't want to suggest that this focus on domestic issues means no leadership abroad. That's not what I foresee. I foresee what you just mentioned, and that is less emphasis on the projection of power, less willingness to get into land wars in the Middle East, and more emphasis on diplomacy, more emphasis on teamwork, more emphasis on joining with like-minded states to get things done. So I think far from the US not showing up, I think the US is going to show up diplomatically big time because it will see itself as the catalyst for getting joint action across the board. And so I do think it's important, and your question suggested this, to distinguish between the militarization, or what I would call the over-militarization of US foreign policy, and diplomacy. I think you'll see the militarization pull back, but I think on the diplomatic front, the United States will lean in.
So back and forth with different questions. Which country is this President Biden going to visit first? Just a few takes. Let's do like predictions here.
That's a tough question. I think historically, the President of the United States usually meets first with the neighbors.
So Canada,
Mexico and Canada.
Canada.
But I'm guessing that you will see a fairly early ingathering of some subset of Europeans or some Europeans, because Biden is an Atlanticist.
Mhm.
Biden believes in NATO. Biden believes that the United States has teamed up with Europeans since World War II to make the world a better place. And I think he's going to want to try to start repairing the damage that Trump has done. Whether that's a NATO summit or, you know, a visit to Germany, I don't know. But I would predict some kind of allied initiative early on.
He's talked about a League of Democracies or Democratic Cooperative Network. So,
Well, he's talked about a summit of the democracies. That's a tough one,
it is.
right? I mean, if the people on this call tried to decide who gets to come and who doesn't, who's a democracy and who's not a democracy, should Poland and Hungary be invited? It would get very complicated very fast. So I think if I were advising him, I'd probably aim a little bit more modestly for a gathering of allies, a kind of statement that America is back, American alliances, we stand by them. And I'm also someone who is not a big fan of trying to organize the world on the basis of regime type. We got a lot of problems on our plate. And I would rather see the US take a pragmatic approach to teamwork. And if that teamwork involves Saudi Arabia and China and Egypt, that's okay with me.
Which are no democracies, by the way, but they're
Right.
important for other strategic reasons. I have a short one, or Jorge, do you want to?
No, just let's go ahead. Karen, I can ask.
So the which is almost dead, the so-called transatlantic trade and investment partnership TIP, that's dead, right? So do you see any chance of reviving it between the US and the EU?
You know, there was progress made on the issue, and there were discussions about what were called early harvest. That is to say, you take what we've agreed and you sign a modest deal, and the big sticking issues, which include agriculture,
Yeah.
they include public procurement, they include, as you already asked, Karen, about Boeing and Airbus. So we just agree to disagree, and we do what we can. I could imagine that you could get some kind of very modest agreement on something, just as a sign, as a hey, you know, we care about this. But a full TTIP that goes back to taking on these big, tough issues, including agriculture and procurement, I don't think we have the bandwidth for that right now.
And it depends on the US Senate as well, because I think it has to ratify any international treaty, and who knows. Well, another prediction, what will happen in Georgia in January?
Yeah, I mean, it's
We're all looking at Georgia right now.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't talked about this much, but one of the other reasons that I think that the US will be very preoccupied at home is that we remain a country that's quite divided.
Right.
And if the Democrats don't win the Senate, and I think they probably won't, then it's going to be very tough. It's going to be very tough for Biden to get a lot of domestic legislation through, particularly on the big ticket items that we've been talking about. pandemic stimulus, investment in infrastructure, worker retraining, free trade. And as I said, 74 million people voted for Trump. The Democrats lost seats in the House. If, I believe the number that I read recently is if Trump had won 0.7% more votes, he would be the president. And if you look at if you added up the margin of victory in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, the states that brought Biden the victory, it's not a lot of votes. And so this is not going to be easy. And I'll just offer one quick historical reflection. The last time a Democratic president took office without a Democratic Senate was in 1884. So it's a big deal.
Charles, let's give in the big deal. And can you imagine the first 100 days? It's too important from Roosevelt for the incoming president. What do you think it should be the main topics or the agenda in the US-EU relationship for this period, the 100 days, the priorities?
Mm-hmm. I think I'd probably identify three things. One is a collective conversation on our shared domestic problems, starting with the pandemic. That's what average people want to hear about. They want to know when they can go out again. They want to know when their local restaurant will reopen. They want to know when their kid can go back to school, right? I'm speaking personally. I've got 3 young kids and they're all downstairs running around all day long and all night long. And I love having them here, but I kind of wish they could go back to school. And so I think the first thing you got to do is you got to talk about getting our countries back open, and we should talk about that together. And also this general issue of job creation. The second agenda item would be just rebuilding transatlantic trust. There's been a lot of damage, and I just think we need to come right out and say we remain an anchor of liberal democracy, and we're going to stand by our values. And the third would be China, where I think the conversation is probably going to be not easy. But I do worry that if you don't have that conversation early, we could find ourselves in day 300 rather than 100 with something happening and the US and the EU taking different positions on China, and that could be harmful. So it'd be those three.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you. Charles, we've made you go from one topic to the other, and we're really thankful. We talked about trade, about Russia, about China, about democracy, about Trump's foreign policy failures, and also what you also mentioned is good decisions. We really want to thank you very much for participating in this call. And next time we'll invite you to Chile when we have vaccine, hopefully. That would be great, and I look forward to that.
Well, I'm gonna hold you to that promise.
Absolutely.
I'll take an in-person rain check. I've never been, so a visit is overdue.
Absolutely. Unless we find, news in the newspaper in the next few days that you've been offered interesting position. So that's another thing we look forward to if you go to strengthens President Biden's team. We're all in Chile very much looking forward to his government. And also one topic that we didn't address, but restoring in some way relationships with South America, which there haven't been any, and not even, to be fair, since the Obama administration. So we're not in anybody's map right now. So hopefully we will. And at least some of our countries will be invited to the League of Democracies meeting. But thanks again to everybody. Thank you. We will post, as always, this the recording in our respective websites with Jorge and ours. So thanks very much.
My pleasure. Stay safe, everyone.
Stay safe. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.